BBC during the W. Bush years, they just lied that there's a secret parallel nuclear program that's really a nuclear weapons program that's going on there too. And the IAEA can't find it, but trust us, it's there. And they never explained it because they couldn't, because they were lying. They just heavily implied it all the time. Secret, illicit nuclear weapons program, as though the thing existed, which it never did. And we almost went to war over it a couple of times, but it was stopped in 2007 by the commander of CENTCOM, Admiral Fallon, and then later the CIA and the National Intelligence Council put out their NIE of November 2007 saying they have not decided to make nuclear weapons. Bush complained in his memoir, W. Bush, that, well, how was I supposed to attack them? He said, oh, I'm so sorry, Your Highness, to the King of Saudi Arabia. I can't attack them because my own intelligence agencies say they're not making nukes. And if they don't have a military program, I can't do anything. So his hands were tied, he thought. And then this was essentially the status quo until Obama comes in. And Netanyahu comes in right before Obama does. It comes back to power. And he starts threatening like he's going to attack Iran and drag us into it. At this point, Zbigniew Brzezinski even said, if Netanyahu flies planes over Iraq to attack Iran, Obama should shoot them down over Iraq. So I know Robert Kennedy says Brzezinski was the founder of the neoconservative movement, but no, he was never a neocon, and they hated each other sometimes. They worked together on Russia issues. He was a two-state solution guy and definitely not a Likudnik, and not on Iran, especially. Obama was, I think, really worried. And a lot of people were really worried that Netanyahu was going to start the war in his first term and drag him into it. And so the way to prevent that was to create the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the John Kerry nuclear deal.
That was the point of it.
That was the point, was we already have an NPT and we already have a safeguards agreement, but essentially everybody's pretending that they don't exist. The Western media is following the Likud party line that there's essentially nothing stopping Iran from making a nuke right now if we don't hit them. So Obama said, fine, we'll just add another layer of deal on top of that. So,
but the Iran deal was a way to keep Netanyahu from starting a war with Iran and dragging us in.
Yes, although
I feel like
I think he was bluffing.
Movie.
I don't think Netanyahu really was going to do it back then. I think he did it here because he had Trump's permission. I'm not certain of that. I don't know if you know, but I don't know that it's really clear exactly, but I think at that time he was really just bluffing and was trying to get Obama to do something, at least to roll back their program, if not completely eliminate it. But so what they did was the JCPOA, Trump called it the worst deal that any men ever signed or whatever. It's just not really true. I mean, what it did was it severely rolled back their nuclear program. So they poured concrete in their Arak, that's ARAK, their Arak heavy water reactor. They severely restricted the number of centrifuges spinning at Natanz by 2/3, I believe it was. They turned the Fordo, or the COM facility, into a research-only facility, no uranium production there. And then the deal is that they wanted to, the American side wanted for Iran to export any stockpile of enriched nuclear material out of the country, so that if they withdrew from the treaty and kicked the inspectors out of the country and started beating their chest and declared, now we're making a bomb, it would take them a year. This is what they call the breakout period. There's two.
This, in my opinion, was one of the best interviews of the history of Iran, Israel, and United States, and their whole back and forth that's currently going on. Props to Tucker Carlson for bringing on someone like Scott Horton on. I've seen Scott Horton on Piers Morgan's show. He actually became pretty famous. He's an author. He wrote books like Provoked on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And in my opinion, he has been one of the best historians on this topic. I mean, he knows so much. I was very impressed, and I'm surprised not many people have watched this. This was a 3-hour interview. I went through it and selected the best moments, so you don't have to go and sit and watch the whole 3-hour interview. If you do appreciate that, you can show your appreciation by just simply liking this video and subscribing to my channel. What that does is I can spread this video out to a larger audience. More people can change their minds, and it really just helps out the channel. Thanks. Now let's continue.
Roots to the nuclear bomb. Forget the H bomb for a minute. We're just talking about fission bombs, atom bombs. The plutonium route, like the Nagasaki bomb, was already precluded because even though their heavy water reactor produces plutonium waste, it's heavily polluted with other isotopes. And so you need a reprocessing facility to get all that out to make usable fuel. They don't have that reprocessing facility. The Russians had the right to come and get all their waste and take it back to Russia to be diluted down there. So there was no plutonium route to the bomb. Now, the uranium route to the bomb was that if Iran broke out and raced to a bomb in that 1 year breakout capability, it's virtually like unanimous among the experts that if they wanted to race and get a bomb as fast as they could, it would be a simple gun type nuke like the kind America dropped on Hiroshima, which is essentially a uranium slug fired into a uranium target, and it just causes a supercritical mass there. But to do that, it's too big to miniaturize and fit onto Iran's missiles and their nose cones or any of that. So if they raced to a nuke, they would have one that they could test in the desert, but they couldn't really deliver other than strap it to the back of a flatbed truck or like put it in an airliner or something,
right,
which they couldn't get to Israel and they couldn't use it. If they were to even make an implosion bomb with uranium, though, it would take years worth of testing and development to get the implosion system right to make it work. So they couldn't race toward a bomb if they wanted to make a bomb small enough to marry to a missile to be able to deliver to anyone. So in other words, even if they withdrew from the treaty, kicked out the inspectors and started making nukes, it's very likely that their first nuke or two would be simple, undeliverable gun type nukes. That would be not much more of a deterrent than their latent deterrent. So now Trump gets out of the deal in 2018 at Netanyahu's behest.
You know, what's really crazy is that at the time, everyone thought, Trump made a great move by getting out of the Iran deal. And, it was a horrible deal. We unfroze so much of the money that Iran had. But the more you find out about the details, it was a solid deal made by Obama. And I think now there's unanimous consent on that. Like, everyone believes that it was a good deal and Trump should not have backed out. It's pretty sad that most people did not know the details of it in those days. And it's most likely that Trump only got out of it because of Netanyahu, like Scott mentioned.
And there were problems with the deal. It had sunset provisions in it that said, after a certain period of time, you can increase your number of centrifuges again and these other things. Now, I believe that if Trump had come in and told Netanyahu to pipe down in his first term, and had said to the Ayatollah, now listen, I don't like this deal. It was my predecessor's deal and I want to improve it. Let's get along. We'll take it at face value. I came into office with this agreement. Let's see if we can improve it. Let's see if we can get rid of some of these sunset provisions. Let's see if we can find a way to renegotiate the deal and make it better. He didn't do that. He just withdrew. And in consequence of that, it's actually part of the deal that Iran is allowed to stop abiding by some of the restrictions in the deal and still stay within the deal if America breaks its agreement first. Enriching after Israel murdered their top weapons scientist, Fakhrizadeh, his top nuclear scientist. I don't know that he was a weapons scientist at all. Their top nuclear scientist in December of 20, they started enriching up to 20% again, which is still legitimate. They need 20% enriched uranium-235 for their medical isotope reactors. But then in April, the Israelis did a sabotage mission at Natanz, and they bragged about it. They were the ones who did it. And in reaction to that, the Iranians then started enriching up to 60% uranium-235. Now, you need really above 90% to make an effective uranium atom bomb. It's technically possible to make one with above 80% enriched uranium-235. Mark Dubowitz says you can make one with 60% enriched uranium-235, but I don't think that's really right. But anyway.
What's the point of doing it then?
Typically up to 60%. Right. Good question. Because this is what you'll hear all the hawks say. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and all of them say over and over again, that, oh yeah, well, what do they need the 60% for? To negotiate away. That was why. They're trying to get America back in the deal. If they had wanted to race toward weapons-grade uranium, they could have just raced toward weapons-grade uranium and enriched it up to 90%.
And this is something that I personally did not know, and I'm sure many of you did not know either, that constantly you hear a lot of Republicans saying, that, oh, why does Iran have enriched, not even Republicans, just people that support Israel. Why does Iran have so much enriched uranium? Listen, there's different levels to it. They had 20% as per the deal they were allowed to. That's not nearly enough to make any weapons. And that's what Scott Horton here clarifies. And I'm sure many people did not know that. But because of all the issues and provoking that Israel is doing to Iran, now they're at like 60%.
They're going up to 60 because it makes them closer. It means their breakout time is shorter, and they're trying to put pressure on the Americans to get back into the deal, which we already had and which they are still officially a part of. And so that was why they were going up to 60%.
What do you mean they're still officially a part of it?
They're still officially part because they signed the JCPOA with France and Britain, the United States, Russia, and China, all the members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So they're still part of the JCPOA. It still is the law, basically. It's still the international law and their agreement. But as I said, there are subsections of the agreement itself that say that if America stops abiding by our part of it, they can stop abiding by some of the restrictions, even while remaining inside the deal. So they were really just, the purpose of the 60% was to try to force America back to the table.
Now, I'm not sure if that deal even exists now after Trump sent the whole mission of blowing up their nuclear facilities. So one, there's that they just blew up the facilities. And now it's like, and I believe Iran just kicked out the last few agents that were there to inspect their facilities. So now we really have no idea what Iran's doing and what they're not. And it's just pretty much all speculation and intelligence from Israel, which is very biased, right? So, yeah, I mean, didn't think ahead, Trump.
And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was so disingenuous. I saw him give a statement on the Sunday Morning News Show last week, where I guess on This Week, where he says, the only countries that have 60% uranium have nuclear weapons. Oh, come on, man. That's just obfuscation. You know, if we're making nuclear weapons out of uranium, it's not at 60%, which all ours are plutonium bombs anyway. But he knows what he's doing when he says that, right? He wants you to understand that Iran is racing toward a nuke without actually claiming that, because he knows it's really not true. And then there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for the 60%. It was to negotiate away. But so now Trump gives them their deadline. They pass the deadline. And I'm not exactly certain what happens, but Israel starts the war. Donald Trump comes in, a week into it, 10 days into it, and bombs Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Isfahan is where they have the conversion facility to transform uranium ore and metal to gas and then back again. It has to be uranium hexafluoride gas is what they spin and enrich, and then they turn it back into metal. And they bombed all three of those. And I don't know for certain the extent of the damage, although I did read a report by David Albright, who's a nuclear weapons expert, who talked about they got commercial satellite footage, and he seemed to think that they had done significant damage to Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, and all the important nuclear facilities there. So in other words, Donald J. Trump called the Ayatollah's bluff. You say you have a latent nuclear deterrent and I better not attack you or else then you might make one, which he never said that outright, but that was clearly the implication of the Iranian program. All right, well, I'm bombing your program. So now what are you going to do?
See, this is another thing. There's so much conflicting data on because, and now you question this stuff because you don't find out till years later. So Trump is saying that he destroyed their facilities. And I think Scott Horton just said they pretty much had significant damage to their facilities. But then you hear other outlets saying that, no, we actually did not destroy all of their facilities. It's still intact. And, Iran moved most of their uranium away. And I think a lot of that comes from Israeli intelligence, which who knows how biased that is. But now, what really happened? No one knows. We don't even have agents there, right?
And their other bluff was that they would shoot their mid-range missiles at our bases in the Gulf region. In Qatar, we have CENTCOM headquarters at the Al Udeid Air Base there, and our 5th Fleet is stationed at Bahrain. We have tens of thousands of Army soldiers in Kuwait, and they were all essentially hostage to Iranian missiles. But when it came down to it, they didn't dare. That was their bluff. We called their bluff, and they didn't dare. What they do? Trump dropped 14 bombs on them. They fired 14 missiles at Qatar, and they called him in advance and warned him, we're about to fire 14 missiles. Get ready to shoot them down. In other words, a purely symbolic retaliation against the United States. While they're still firing missiles at Tel Aviv, he didn't dare to hit American forces in the Gulf, not this time at least, for probably out of fear of what Donald Trump would do. Now, this is the same Ayatollah who they say can't wait to cause the apocalypse and nuke Israel. Even if every last Iranian gets nuked off the face of the earth, he doesn't care because he wants the end of the world. And yet he doesn't dare pick a fight with Donald Trump and telegraphs, I do not want to fight you every chance that he gets with the American superpower.
The U.S. paid for the chemical weapons that Saddam used against the Iranians and the Kurds.
And they even spun it for him when he
That's
used them
so
against the Kurds.
bonkers
They
that-
blamed it on Iran. The DIA did a big report blaming it on Iran when Saddam gassed Halabja, which, was in Colin Powell's speech of why we have to attack them. And I was like, back then, y'all covered for him. I mean, Colin Powell was Reagan's national security advisor, right? He was in the administration at the time when they blamed that on Iran.
So crazy.
It is.
And just to linger for one more moment, we know that's true.
Oh, yeah. There's, in fact, at FFF.org, the Future Freedom Foundation, there's an article by Jacob Hornberger that I believe is called Where Did Saddam Get His WMD? And he has links to like 10 very thorough sources all about this. There's no question about it. They admitted over and over. Post, Times, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, whatever.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And then, 20 years later, we're invading Iraq because he might have chemical weapons.
Right. And it turned out
no one mentions this?
Yeah. And it turned out years later, the only ones that they ever found in the country were from the 80s. Stuff that America had helped them purchase from the Europeans then.
This is just crazy stuff, man. Mind-blowing, mind-boggling. And yet, this is just our history, and many people like Scott Horton know this. And the mass public did not know this because social media wasn't a thing back then. And stuff like YouTube wasn't around back then. And so you had to rely on all of your news from the main media outlets. And they're able to brainwash people, essentially. I mean, there was very fringe minorities who knew the details. Most people didn't at the time.
It was the only stuff that anyone ever found. And that was why they covered it up, was because this is stuff that Ronald Reagan and George Bush's father had helped supply them. And so we don't really want to emphasize that so much when the claim had been that there was an ongoing program to develop this stuff circa early 2000s, which of course couldn't have been further from the truth. But now, so the same time that the Iran-Iraq horrific bloodbath is going on, the Iran-Iraq war, America's supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And this included, as we were just talking about, the Arab Afghan Army, the International Islamist Brigades or Islamic Brigades. And these were mostly Arabs, but included Americans and Chechens and Filipinos and people from all over the place, went and traveled to Afghanistan to fight, to essentially bolster the Afghan Mujahideen in their war against the Soviet Union.
I knew people who did that, yes.
And when I was a kid, this was an open secret. They made Rambo 3 about it. And I remember...
This is something that Bassem Youssef had mentioned as well, that in Rambo 3, we actually helped the terrorists in Afghanistan, and we were supporting them to fight the Soviet Union. Just crazy. And obviously, kids these days, I mean, myself included, we had no idea about this stuff because we were born after it.
And I was very interested in this. I was 9th grade at the time, very interested in the war. I don't remember the words His Royal Highness King Al-Jaber being mentioned once on the news, that was what the war was for, to reinstall King Al-Jaber to his throne, right? Like I don't even remember hearing that name a single time during all that. We just must protect the poor Kuwaitis. And of course they lied. And they pretended that Saddam was lining up his tanks on the Saudi border and was prepared to invade Saudi Arabia, which was a total hoax, never happened. And the St. Petersburg, Florida Times got Soviet satellite pictures that showed nothing but empty desert out there. And I've known guys who were stationed there said, yeah, they came and tested the border a little bit and left, but there never was mechanized divisions lined up prepared to invade on Riyadh. All they had to do was warn Hussein, you better not go to Riyadh, pal, or you're going to deal with us. He wasn't ever going to go. And then they lied about the atrocities, and the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States lied before the Congress and said that she was a nurse at the hospital in Kuwait City and saw Iraqi soldiers dump premature babies out of the incubators and leave them on the cold floor to die, she said, and steal their incubators. And George Bush and the PR people repeated this, senior that is, and the PR people repeated this numerous times as example of why we absolutely had to intervene for humanitarian reasons to save the poor Kuwaitis. Total hoax. She was not a nurse and she wasn't even in the country at the time of the invasion. It was all just a made up lie, but it was good enough to create the moral outrage in the country to get people to support the war. Now, the reason I dwell on this, is because mostly people look at Iraq War I as this huge success. It's a 100-hour land war. We got to showcase all our laser guided munitions flying down chimneys and in windows and all of this, like brand new space age 21st century technology. And it was just short and sweet. We lost less than 100 guys or less than 200 guys, depending on how you count them, from various accidents and whatever. And so it was just known as, it was just wonderful at the time. It was Operation Yellow Ribbon. And George Bush Sr. said, by God, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. We're back, baby. Now we can have wars again. And in fact, Brent Scowcroft did say specifically that this was one of the reasons that they wanted to have the war, was to beat Vietnam syndrome, to give the American people a cheap and quick and easy win on the Powell Doctrine, in and out, kick their butt and get out of there quickly and call it a victory and get the American people to mix their patriotism with militarism again, like the good old days. And it worked. It was explicitly one of their goals. And yet there's a huge rub, a big wrinkle in the story, which is the Shiite and Kurdish uprising that took place about 6 weeks later after the end of the war.
For those that don't know, including myself, the Vietnam syndrome was basically American public reluctance to go into any foreign fight, foreign intervention. And we're kind of getting back into that now, but that's what it used to be. And then after that, Iraq War #1 with George W. Bush's father, once he won that war, it was like, okay, American public is back into it now.
Bush Sr. personally, in a radio message over Voice of America, and the Air Force dropped leaflets over the Shiite army divisions in the south of the country, which America occupied the entire south of Iraq in the aftermath of the war. And they encouraged all of these Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. But so what happened was they were on their way to Baghdad, but George Bush and his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, Secretary of State Baker, Secretary of Defense Cheney, they changed their mind. And they left the Shiites high and dry, and they let Saddam Hussein keep his helicopters and tanks to crush the revolution. Why? It was because, remember when I said, when the Iranian Revolution happened, some of these Iraqi Shiites went to Iran and sided with the Iranians and wanted to import the revolution into Iraq. And that was why Saddam conscripted them all to fight the war, right? Because that was what he was afraid of. Well, they started coming back across the border from Iran, namely the Badr Brigade, which was the armed militia of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was a group of Iraqis tied very closely to the Dawa Party who were supported by Iran and had been living in Iran for the last 10 years and had fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq War. Now they're coming across the border to lead the revolution. So this is the Bush Senior administration. These are all the Reaganites, right? This is Ronald Reagan's vice president and all of his men. Dick Cheney was the only new guy. He had come from the House. All of the rest of them had been Reagan administration officials. So they're all saying to themselves, oh my God, we just spent 9 years, supporting Saddam Hussein's war against Iran to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we're importing it. We're going to be the ones to put it in power in Baghdad. Oops. So they called it off, and they let Saddam Hussein massacre 100,000 people or so in order to crush that insurrection and stay in power. Oof. Probably a misunderstanding. I've convinced Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, both, for example, are the worst presidents we've ever had. And personally, I despise them. So I don't anyone take me wrong like I'm saying anything nice about the guy who burned all the Branch Davidians babies to death.
Noted.
But Bill Clinton idiotically had said, maybe we can get along with Iraq and bring them back in from the cold. I forgot his exact words, poor paraphrase, but he had indicated maybe we can normalize relations with Iraq. Well, that set a few different groups into a panic, namely the Kuwaitis. And I'm sure you're familiar with the allegations, at least, that Saddam Hussein tried to kill George H.W. Bush with a truck bomb attack in Kuwait in 1993. Well, that was a damn lie. And it was invented by the father of the girl who told the Kuwait, the incubators hoax. It was the same guy whose daughter did that, was the same guy who invented the assassination of Bush Sr. hoax, which almost everybody still believes. So they've never heard it contradicted. But in fact, Seymour Hersh wrote a piece in the New Yorker completely debunking it before the end of the year.
Wow, I guess it's an old tactic. Reminds me of Benjamin Netanyahu just out of thin air claiming that the assassination of Trump was from Iran, just out of nowhere.
Called Case Not Closed. And It's about how it was just a whiskey smuggling ring. And they just embellished it into this murder plot against Bush Sr., which is never any such thing. It's probably part of the reason that we had the War of '03 was that W. Bush believed that that story was true. And I think probably, to this day, almost everybody seems to still believe that, but it wasn't true. But it was on the occasion of that hoax that Bill Clinton went ahead and gave in to his new foreign policy aide, a guy named Martin Indyk, who had been Yitzhak Shamir's guy, who was the former terrorist and Likud party prime minister of Israel, who Bush Sr. had tangled with. And
I don't think Martin Indyk was Americanized. I remember he was Australian.
Right. An Australian, and then had lived in Israel and was an advisor to the Likud.
So what is he doing in our government?
Good question. So he's also the founder of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which you'll see their guys quoted all the time as just bland, middle-of-the-road experts on everything Middle East, when it was literally founded by a Likud guy as a spinoff of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, who put up the money for it. And that's not true of all neocon think tanks. It is the case with WINEP. There's a direct spinoff of AIPAC, and it was at WINEP where Indyk went and gave his speech inaugurating what was called the dual containment policy. And that dual containment policy was born in Israel. And the idea was, where Bill Clinton is saying, hey, maybe we can normalize with Iraq. Maybe we can normalize with Iran. In fact, this is a good place to mention that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had all this egg on his face from the Iranian Revolution, now it's 1993, and he's saying we ought to try to get along with Iran. We ought to bring them in from the cold. And we could build an oil pipeline from Azerbaijan through Iran and to the Persian Gulf as a way that we can make money together and begin to warm up relations. And so instead of having a Cold War against Iraq and Iran, we can go ahead and normalize relations with both. And in fact, Alexander Haig, who had been Reagan's Secretary of State, as previously mentioned, found the green light memo there, or wrote the green light memo that Robert Perry found. He also agreed with Brzezinski. And this is first year of Bill Clinton. And now we can begin to normalize relations with Iran. We ought to build oil pipelines across Iran. And we have those interests in common. You might even remember Dick Cheney caused a minor stir. He was the chairman of Halliburton, and in 1997 and 98, he gave repeated statements.
So I worked in aerospace. I've worked with companies like Halliburton in the past. No idea that Dick Cheney was on the board of that. Wow. News to me.
Statements condemning Bill Clinton's sanctions and saying we should get along with Iran, and because
And I know they do oil and gas as well.
after all, God didn't see fit to only put oil under the ground of countries with Western democracies, but we have to do business with them anyway, and we can. Who's afraid of the Ayatollah anyway? We're the USA, right? Nobody can mess with us. That was what Dick Cheney said, and it caused a little scandal because he said it in Australia in 1998. He said it numerous times, but in 98 he said it in Australia, and that's a big sin to criticize your country from foreign soil, right? So it was like a little bit of a scandal. But what was he saying? He was saying we can be reasonable and deal with these guys. But anyway, in the early 90s, this was the position of Brzezinski and Haig and others that now we can try to get along. But it was the Israelis who said no. They vetoed it and insisted on this dual containment policy. Iraq, because we just beat them up so bad in Iraq War I, they're too weak to balance against Iran. So America has to stay in Saudi to balance against them both. This then, Tucker, is a main reason why the Arab-Afghan Mujahideen that we had built up to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan then turned against the United States. Bin Laden wanted to use his men to repel the Iraqis from Kuwait and to protect the Saudi kingdom, and was outraged that the king gave in and let a bunch of white Christian forces from across the ocean come and defend Saudi instead. And then not only that, but they broke their promise. It's so fun.
See, Scott Horton knows the history so well because you never hear this narrative in Western media. He knows the narratives from all different sides, which is very impressive.
Funny. Bill Kristol one time interviewed Dick Cheney for 2 hours. Bill Kristol has a podcast. Interviewed him for like 2 hours, and they talked about everything under the sun except Iraq War II. They just didn't mention it at all. But
is that true?
It's true. It's so funny. I
can't believe you listened to the whole Bill Kristol
Well,
podcast.
you can watch it on double speed, our president said this is a strong guy with a very strong past. Well, his strong past is murdering American soldiers, fighting and killing American soldiers in Mosul and Ramadi during Iraq War II.
And I believe he's talking about the new guy who's in charge of Syria, who used to be in the Taliban.
Sanctions against him.
Because that's what Israel wants, because Israel hates the Shiites more, and the Alawites were friends with the Shiites. And so they don't mind the bin Ladenites, even though the bin Ladenites targeted us over Israel's crimes. They've never given Israel a problem directly. And in fact, one of the Israeli intelligence or military officials admitted to the press when he was asked, why do you guys give aid and comfort to Al-Qaeda in the war? You give them medical treatment and all these things. And he said, well, it's the humanitarian thing to do. And they said, well, do you give that same kind of support to Hezbollah when they're injured on the battlefield? And he goes, well, of course not. They're our enemies. And the reporter says, yeah, but Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. He says, yeah.
Sorry, not the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, I think.
Well, what's that got to do with us? So they're worried about their national interests, and our country's somehow worried about their national interests instead of ours. So why in the world would any American prefer a bin Ladenite to Assad, a Ba'athist? Only because they hate the Shiites more. Only because they put Israel's interests before those of the United States. That's the one and only answer to that. After the Iranian Revolution, the Israelis stayed friends with Iran. And you might remember during Iran-Contra when the Reaganites skipped...
With the Ayatollah in charge?
With the Ayatollah in charge. The mean old Ayatollah with the dark circles around his eyes. That one.
Yeah. He was on every dartboard in my neighborhood.
Yeah, I bet.
In 1980, yeah.
So, but the Israelis stayed friends with him. So you might remember during Iran-Contra when the Reaganites sold missiles to Iran, when they switched sides in the war temporarily in the Iran-Iraq war, they used the Israelis as cutouts to do it. You give them your TOW missiles and we'll give you more to repay you, basically. And they had this relationship that they maintained through the early 1990s. And it was in 1993 that Yitzhak Rabin decided to turn Israeli foreign policy upside down. They had what had been called the strategy of the periphery, which meant they wanted to focus on their alliance with Turkey in the north to divide Syria's attention. They wanted to back Iran in their east to divide Iraq's attention. They wanted to support Ethiopia in their south to divide Egypt's attention. Does that make sense? But then Rabin said, no, we're going to turn this around now. And what we're going to do is we want to negotiate with the Palestinians, with Arafat, and create not a real Palestinian state, but sort of a pseudo-Palestinian state. Best thing that they had on offer, going for sure. And in doing so, then we'll put aside the last major issue. We can negotiate with the closer Arab states. They already had their peace treaty with Egypt, but they could now make their peace deal with Jordan, which they did complete in 1994, and negotiate with the Gulf states as well. But part of that being negotiate with the Palestinians, because the Gulf states especially had always promised they would never normalize relations with Israel until the Palestinians either got an independent state or citizenship in a single state.
Just a quick reminder, if you enjoyed this video so far, make sure you like this video and subscribe to my channel. Really helps out. Let's finish this video.
What Rabin wanted to do then was he decided to begin to demonize the Iranians as like just politics, right? To keep the right off his back while he's negotiating with Arafat. He's going to say, yeah, but look at those bad guys over there, essentially, and demonize the Iranians as part of that policy. So it was Israel that turned on Iran first, and for no particular thing that Iran had done to them. They had kept Iran out of the Madrid peace conference, which was like an insult, but it was not that big of a deal. And as I believe Trita Parsi shows in his book, Treacherous Alliance, and Gareth Porter in his book, Manufactured Crisis, it was the Iranians only turned on the Israelis after the Israelis had turned on them. And in fact, Trita Parsi in his book talks about how when the Israelis announced, hey, we hate Iran now and we want you to hate Iran now, the Clintonites all started laughing because they were like, what? You loved Iran and wanted us to be friends with Iran last week. Now you've changed your mind? Like, why? And so it just had caught them by surprise.
What was the relationship pre-93 between Israel and Iran?
Well,
was there a commercial relationship?
Mostly, yeah, weapons and oil. So as Trita shows, the Ayatollah would be raging, I'm going to destroy Israel. That day, he would be taking a shipment of missiles from Israel, right? And so all that bluster was cover for their covert
Israel,
relationship.
Just to, again, to linger on a point, because it's surprising to hear it. Mm-hmm. Israel was supplying Iran with weapons as late as the 1990s?
Yes.
Confirmed.
Yeah. Getting along with them all the way up until the very beginning of Bill Clinton.
But not just getting along with, but sending them weapons.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure when the last weapons shipment took place, but certainly through the Iran-Iraq war, Israel was backing Iran. And this was the cynical thing by the Reaganites too, that they would give permission to the Israelis to increase support for Iran, and then they would switch and increase support for Iraq and play them back and forth against each other like that through the war.
That's pretty dishonorable.
Yeah, it's pretty dishonorable indeed. But it also goes to show, though, that like all this crap about, fundamentalist Shiite Islam, well, I don't know. The Likud got along with the Ayatollah just fine, or maybe not just fine, but they kept their relationship all through the 90s. And it was the Israelis who decided to turn on them over, politics that were closer to home that really weren't about Iran as much as they needed a bad guy to point their finger at while changing the policy and negotiating with the Palestinians. But then, of course, a Benjamin Netanyahu fan assassinated Rabin in 95. And it was his successor, Shimon Peres, as part of this same strategy, though, who launched Operation Grapes of Wrath in 1996. Now, as I said, Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh filled out their last will and testament when that began. And
because they were upset.
And by the way, it's Lebanese Shiites who are being killed here, but there's the same difference to them. They've still felt shared solidarity with the victims there that they wanted to avenge. And then it was in that summer of 96 was when bin Laden put out his first declaration of war. Get this, it's called Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. Pretty subtle, right?
Yeah.
So, and then in the beginning of the thing, it starts out with a whole rant about not just Grapes of Wrath, but the Qana massacre. It's now known as the first Qana massacre because they did it again in 2006. But in 1996, it was actually Naftali Bennett, the future prime minister of Israel, was the artillery officer who called in a strike on a United Nations shelter and killed 106 women and children. And bin Laden went off about.
That is crazy. That's crazy. Israel attacked a United Nations place and killed 106 people, and no one talks about that. They are the real terrorist nation here.
Out that in his declaration of war against the United States in 1996. Said, we'll never forget the severed heads and arms and legs of the children in Qana. And when Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Mohammed Atta read that was when they decided to join the war. So here are Egyptian engineering students in Hamburg, Germany, volunteering for a Saudi to kill Americans as revenge for what Israel's doing in Lebanon, which, Tucker, is why they told you that the Taliban did it, because they hate our freedom. Because they didn't want to get into why these Saudis and Egyptians did it. It's because they hate our foreign policy. The Taliban, most of them had probably never even heard of the New World and had no grudge against us at all. In fact, their government had tried to warn the United States of an impending al-Qaeda attack. And their leader, Mullah Omar, had been trying to negotiate bin Laden away since 1998 after the Africa embassy bombings. And it was even the CIA officer, Milton Bearden, who helped to run the Afghan operation in the 1980s, who told the Washington Post the Taliban were trying to give this guy up. They would say, geez, he's out falconing. We don't know where he is. Meaning he's outside of our protection. And if you guys were to kill him, it wouldn't be our fault. And then the Americans would say, we said hand him over. And just refuse to listen to that's what they're doing, is handing him over, Yeah. Mullah Omar told, I bet Arnaud de Bourgrave from the Washington Times. I interviewed him.
I knew him well.
Yeah. So Arnaud de Bourgrave interviewed Mullah Omar in the summer of 2001 in Pakistan. And he said, listen, bin Laden is like a chicken bone stuck in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out. So you got to help me, or you Americans need to help me find a way to get rid of this guy, essentially. There's no love lost between those two. But they lied, and they pretended that it was the Taliban who had attacked us. So they didn't want to get into who were these mujahideen. So now, one more thing. So first we did all their attacks and their motives. Now their strategy was to bait us into invading Afghanistan. And this is, as we talked about, the letter between bin Laden and Mullah Omar. So we're trying to get the Americans to invade Afghanistan, and then we'll do to them the same thing that we did to the Soviets. Same thing we had helped them do to the Soviets. So that was the strategy. That was why they tried to knock down the World Trade Center in 93. That was why they hit the Khobar Towers. They didn't think we were going to run away crying. They were trying to get us to double and triple down, to invade, spend money. It's asymmetric war. It's a group of a couple of hundred bandits against the global empire. How did they beat us? They get us to beat ourselves. They get and this is what's poetically beautiful and horrible here is that bin Laden's son, Omar, gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010, where he explains, he says, when Bush was elected, my father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country. He says, Bill Clinton fired missiles at my father and didn't get him. But now this is in 2010. Now you've been in Afghanistan for 10 years and you still don't have him. America then was very smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. So the point being not that George Bush's stupidity makes him innocent. It's that George Bush's stupidity and cruelty and corruption made him the perfect mark for a guy like bin Laden. This wimp with the cowboy hat, pretending he's a tough guy, is going to be very easy to provoke into doing what he wants, right? To get away with bloody murder on his end, which is what the Al-Qaeda guys wanted for our side to do, was to and look at our national debt. You might say it has worked some.
They're
I looked into it, and before the whole September 11th thing happened in 2001, and we ended up going to Iraq. 2001, I believe we had a surplus in this government. How crazy is that? We had a surplus, not a deficit. And I think the trillions of dollars that we owed, it was like at 5 trillion. Compare that to now, it's like 36 trillion, I think.
Upon national character weakness or tick that Americans have, that I have, which is you assume all foreigners are kind of dumb.
Yeah.
And, it's a pretty sophisticated trap that they laid.
Yeah.
It's not higher math or anything, but it's like they were thoughtful in their attempt to destroy the United States. And we didn't give them credit for thinking through anything that they did. I didn't anyway. Since you work on this full time, do you imagine a time in our lifetimes where the attention of the U.S. government is drawn back to the United States? Some attempt is made to improve life here?
Over their dead bodies, I mean, figuratively speaking, that it'll have to be a coalition of Americans who just will not stand for it anymore. I mean, we're already at the point, Tucker, where they would much prefer to back bin Ladenite suicide bombers and fly Predator and Reaper drones around than send the 3rd Infantry Division anywhere. They know we won't stand for it, right? Iraq War II, I think, was the last gasp for these large-scale land invasions. Yeah, we got the Vietnam syndrome again. And we don't want to do that.